Good morning, everyone. Hopefully, we are live and you can see and hear me. If anyone can just drop some thumbs up in the chats or a little wave just to let us know we're live, that'd be perfect. Fantastic. So thank you very much for joining us. This is a session that we've titled Future Ready Cybersecurity Defending the Aerospace Ecosystem. And this is a conversation that spawned from a number of different areas. So obviously we are at Parker Neal, we are members of the North West Aerospace Alliance because we have a personal interest, I would say, from an organisational perspective, but also we understand that within the aerospace ecosystem there are real difficulties when it comes to trying to get the message of cybersecurity out there. We spoke with a few members who struggled to understand where they fit in within the ecosystem, what they needed to do, both from a business perspective, but also, and totally fine to say this, from a commercial perspective as well. How do they go about being compliant to the level that the people that they supply to require? So we decided to settle on this as a topic and bring it to you today in webinar form. Before we jump in and before we get started, let me introduce myself because I am very aware there's quite a lot of people here on this call that I've never spoken to, and you might not know anything about myself or Parker Neal and why we wanted to bring this conversation to you. So my name is, as you can see, Stephen, and I'm the Head of Strategic Solutions at Parker Neal. So my role is effectively working with organisations to help them understand, A, what they can do to help better improve their cybersecurity posture, but also how we, as a company that is focused on working with every organisation to help them raise their baseline of cybersecurity, help them understand what we can do at the most cost and scale appropriate level. So Parker Neal as an organisation, we formed about 4 years ago now. One of our co-founders, Gareth Neal, is here. The other co-founder, Dave Parker, they both originally started in consulting, came from Big Four, and then they went to industry and they worked together within the same organization. Gareth as a Chief Information Security Officer and Dave as the Chief Data Officer. What they realized when they were working together was that the industry of cybersecurity was, to be frank, a little bit broken. There was a really high barrier to entry. It wasn't very accessible based on cost. It wasn't very accessible based on internal knowledge if you didn't have people who were cybersecurity specialists. But also there was a level of elitism around cybersecurity. Gareth and Dave wanted to challenge that because they experienced it while working in industry. And that was where they then moved away from that organization and set up Parker Neal. Now, this is in no way a sales pitch and me trying to tell you about what we do. What I want to do is just give you a little bit of contextualization of why we're here today and our reasoning for existing that brings us to this conversation. So if we talk about today's session, obviously you've got myself there. I will address the elephant in the room. If you're having a quick look at that picture and looking at the one of me, who's that hunk with the luscious long locks. Where are we now? About 2 months ago, shaved my head bald for charity. So I do not have any current headshots. That's why that stud muffin there with the long hair is the one that you'll see. We're going to shortly hear from Danny Dresner. So Danny is a professor of cybersecurity at University of Manchester. What we didn't want to do on this was we set the context of what the conversation looks like, and therefore we set the agenda of what we want to speak about. We wanted to bring somebody like Danny in, who is both a academia specialist, but someone who is also particularly interested and has a vested interest in the space and aerospace industry. However, Danny also comes with some real industry credibility as well, which I'm sure during his introduction he will tell you a little bit more about. So Danny is going to set the scene for us as to the aerospace industry, the space industry, and what cybersecurity threat looks like within it, to then lead us to Gareth's presentation today, which will hopefully be contextualized following what Danny has laid out for us there. I'm going to bring Danny in for everybody now. I'm going to pass over to yourself, mate, to allow for a bit of an introduction, a bit of a scene set.
Great, thanks very much. I hope I've just clicked all the right buttons.
You have indeed.
Not necessarily in the right order, but it's the end result. Actually, maybe that's a little bit of a lesson in as much as there's a lot of practicality to cyber stuff. Yes, there are means and methods. I think people get a lot hung up on saying, oh well, what you need is people, process, and technology, and then they go off on one about process and forget about just getting the balance between the people and technology right, and the process becomes something burdensome and difficult, and probably none more so when it comes to actually making technology secure. So for quite some time I've been quite obsessed with a four-letter word ending in K. Yeah, of course that's risk, but I prefer to see risk as an opportunity, because you've actually got the risk of achieving good things, and at the same time you can be dampening down the bad stuff as well. So I've only got a few minutes just to kind of set the scene. So I'm really grateful for the credentials that Stephen's set for me. So essentially, yeah, if you after this you still want to find out anything about me, kind of look up my LinkedIn page. Anything else is out there on the internet, I suppose. If you can't find that kind of stuff, you might want to have a little bit more of a practice in cyber security. Out of that great melee, so I think it's worthwhile saying that I am an unconventional conventionalist. So although I've been sort of billed as an academic, I came the long way around. From engineering firms, from the National Computing Centre, and have always had security in context. In fact, I was one of the founders of IASME, who you might have heard of, because we were very involved in working with what became the National Cybersecurity Centre to create something called Cyber Essentials, which is kind of the very basic measure of what you should do for cybersecurity. Yes, there are certificates involved, but this is just like good stuff to do. You'd be daft not to do it. A little bit like kind of five a day. Eating fruit and veg doesn't keep you healthy, but you'd be daft not to make sure that you get your liquid intake and your vitamins and all of that kind of stuff. I mean, I'm really lucky. Parker Neal, or what I call one of my dish friends. Two dishes that I'm interested in. One bottom right there with me, the hard hat. When I was up on top of our university facility, you might have heard of it. I'm a little bit shocked that not everybody has heard of Jodrell Bank, but the other one is there in Manchester City Centre, which is our digital security hub, which we run with Barclays, Lancaster University, and Plexel, and it's a great hive of activity, a really good safe space for sharing some of the opportunities and also dampening down those things that might stand against us, and being able to really offer a community. So I was going to say there were two dishes in my life, but the problem is you then start falling into 1970s humour, and I'll end up getting a slap from the wife. So maybe we just won't go there today. Like I said, I've only got 5 minutes, and if you just look at that graphic in the middle, when you're talking about aerospace, just to make things work, and happen safely, that's probably quite a conservative, small c, estimate of the number of different systems that you're dealing with. It's not just the mechanics of the actual devices, it's also making sure you have the right people in the right place. In the civil aviation, for example, it almost behoves one to mention the old joke from The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy, where a spaceship was held up for centuries because they didn't have the lemon-soaked paper napkins. But I know that from experience, it's the little details that count. So from the comfort point of view, in terms and the confidence of customers, and that might just be from the purchasing of something that actually doesn't involve passengers, all the way through to the safety measures and the huge supply chain, then there's an awful lot that people who have not good intentions for what we have can take advantage of, and put our hard work to work for their ends. So it goes back, and that date is actually significant. So if you look at here we are, just a couple of days after the 14th of October, which has two significant issues in terms of cybersecurity. One, if you're a Windows 10 user, you should be by now hopefully signed up for the extended security updates, which means at least your computers will stay safe for the next year, give you time to understand what you need to do for transition, because it is unfortunate that we can't ever cut ourselves off. Once we're online, once we go online, we are connected. People will find connections. So anything that we think there is a level of separation, believe me, there are people out there who will make that not work for us, but for them. The usual suspects are there. If you look at the kind of people who are doing bad things against an aerospace, depending on where you stand politically, then you might be pleased to see that it's not only kind of opposing nations, but some of the challenge with cybersecurity. It puts really sophisticated technology in the hands of, very cliched, people in bedrooms. But people no longer need to be able to develop these systems themselves, because there's a whole business ecosystem below this, where different countries and different criminal networks are selling each other different services. So we need to be at least on the ball. And if we go back to, have we mentioned AI yet? Am I going to be naughty and the first person to mention it? Well, we're going back into 1956, and everybody's getting excited about AI. And 1956 was when, even before Gagarin was up in space, a decision was made to really concentrate on the brains and forget about the rest of the body. So everything from our satellites to our planes to our ground stations are all jumping on the AI bandwagon, but they're not really thinking about the full systemic view of how actions actually carry through, how we can be assured that what we want to happen will happen, and make sure that our adversaries don't actually do bad stuff as well. So of course it's complex, of course it's complicated. So first important thing about 14th of October, it was a couple of days ago. It was when when Windows 10 went out of regular commission. Like I say, there's still a time to get security updates, which is ever so important. One of the cyber essentials, actually. Keep your security machines, your devices up to date. But also, it's the day I started work after my time as a novice, you might say, at what was then Manchester Polytechnic. And I always remember what my supervisor told me on my first day of work, quoted a slide or two ago, is that it's easy. If it's easy, you're not doing it right. Put that together with that observation from John Glenn and the complexity of what we're using, and none of us are using anything which has wholly been created by our own hands. That yes, there are risks. The good news is, in terms of cybernetics, we can steer things in the right direction. Look at what we call in academia. I am a little academic sometimes, to obey the law of requisite variety and be prepared for these risks, to be able to react and adapt and really achieve our objectives, whether that's technical, business, or actually a mixture of both. I don't think you can separate them. But anyway, I hope that hasn't been too scary. In fact, I hope it's actually the opposite, because cybersecurity really is an enabler rather than something to worry about in terms of compliance. If you look at it as an enabler, then the compliance area comes along as a byproduct, and that's a much more healthy attitude to take.
Amazing stuff. Thank you very much, Danny. I love your presentations. They're always good fun. Danny, really great scene set in terms of why we're in this conversation today. And I know obviously attendees in this meeting can't see everybody else who is here. but there is a real mix of people across different industries, different verticals of business that provide into the aerospace ecosystem. And I think what Danny said is absolutely accurate. The vastness of what this ecosystem looks like now, it's so complex, and that supply chain, supply web even is probably a better description of it. Yeah, it's a really good scene set there to understand that everybody is part of it. And I think it absolutely is an important point as well, Danny, that cybersecurity can be an enabler. People do see it as something that is a bit of a blocker sometimes, but absolutely vital in our industry, and will be more vital in years to come for commercial aspects. Suppliers up towards the top of the chain, if we're thinking about our bigger customers, they're going to want to see that people are compliant. Okay, well, let's do the legwork early doors. And you're right, it will enable bigger and better things within the business that will then follow with commercial gain as well. I'm going to pass us over now to Gareth Neal. I gave a quick intro to Gareth before, but enough from me, and over to him. Gareth.
Hi, everyone. Welcome. As Stephen has already mentioned, my name's Gareth Neal, co-founder of Parker Neal. I've spent best part of 20 years in consulting industry, effectively in cybersecurity, whether that be in technical roles, the softer side to cyber, so anything that's kind of governance, risk, control, compliance, and everything else in between. And took the plunge 3.5 years ago, call me crazy or not, to leave the safety net of employment, one could say, to effectively be a founder in a startup, and we've not looked back since, and we're enjoying it. So that's a bit about me. So today, we're just going to kind of build on what Stephen's introduced, and also from what Danny did in terms of the context, to understand a bit more around what we would call the illusion of security. We'll get a bit more into that as we go through, but I want to focus on more the kind of the supply chain threat and risk, and what that looks like, and what we're seeing as an organization across the industry at the moment, and hopefully we're able to kind of add a bit of value as part of that discussion there. We'll talk a bit around what being compliant means, and how that can lead into actually defending your organizations, and then the knock-on effect to the wider supply chain, and then maybe a bit about the future of cybersecurity in the industry. And we might kind of get some highbrow questions, you never know, but there's some not necessarily doom and gloom. We want to keep this positive, and Danny mentioned the word enablement. I think there's a lot of scaremongering and factoring going on in the industry, and it's still shrouded with that. So we want to create more of a positive view over the course of the next certainly 10-15 minutes as we go through. So, talking of positive, that looks quite scary, doesn't it? And a bit of a bear trap, if it were. But ultimately, what we see in the industry is what we would call the compliance trap. Now, the compliance trap, what does that actually mean? So, if we think about the kind of the goal to security, a lot of it is led by contractual obligations, not necessarily the need to be secure. And so you will hear around ISO 27001, NIST, all manner of acronyms. The industry loves a good acronym, and we can't avoid that, unfortunately. But what it means is, in order for tier 1, 2, tier 2, tier 3 suppliers within the aerospace industry, there is that contractual obligation that, in almost a barrier to do business with your prime organizations, you need to have certain certifications, and abide by certain regulations. And that can be quite a burden on certainly a smaller organization. And what it tends to do, it detracts from the actual goal, which is to be secure and actually prioritize the time and the effort to being secure. Now, unfortunately, what it has created, and again, we see this across the sector, is we use the word there, checkbox mentality. So we have policies in place, and these policies certainly when we work with clients and we look at them and say, they look fantastic. They might even read fantastic because someone's used AI to generate something that is, on paper, quite sound and watertight. That doesn't necessarily mean that it's understood. It doesn't necessarily mean that it translates into effective awareness, so that as an organization, whether it is on the shop floor all the way through to management, back office staff, understand what their employer requires of them and what their component part is as part of the journey to be in compliance with it within that organization. So effectively, just having good policies is no longer good enough, and arguably it never has been good enough. So we call it the paper shield. So to an auditor coming in, it will look fantastic, but actually it doesn't necessarily mean that if you have a credible threat or an attack or something that's materialized into a breach, that it's kept you secure. So again, you might look good on paper, but that doesn't equal security. Now, I suppose the takeaway there is, don't let the paperwork fool you into a false sense of security. And this is where we get the illusion that has been created. And it's not just the aerospace industry. This is industry at large, but we certainly see it across the aerospace industry as well. Now, what am I actually saying here is, I'm not saying that we can just throw away the need for certification, and I'm certainly not senior enough or in government to be able to make that claim or influence that. But what I am saying is that rather than it being the goal that we aspire to achieve, the perception needs to be that actually it's the foundation. And you heard it from Danny earlier, that whether it's the starting point or whether it falls out naturally as an inherent outcome of good security, it shouldn't necessarily be the primary focus and the end goal where organizations then stop and effectively take their foot off the pedal. Supply chain as a weapon. So just to kind of illustrate how complex the sector is, you'll have your primary organization in the middle, and then ultimately you've got your primary suppliers. Now, they may talk to each other, they may not, they may be connected, they may be sharing data, most likely, but actually you've then got your tier 2 suppliers, and then you've got your tier 3 suppliers, and then maybe broader along that supply chain journey. And those suppliers will connect, they will talk, they may be sharing data, it may be all three. And trying to understand what that looks like is historically and still currently is a challenge across the sector. But it's also quite a complex web of trying to understand and identify what those connections are and who is talking and connected to who, where, and what, and when. Now, over in the top right, I think everyone can probably resonate that cyber attackers with, hoodies on, a laptop, I think that's an anonymous mask as well, just to kind of complete the cliche. What we're kind of saying here is, it's not that your kids in basements and the bedrooms aren't kind of playing around and seeing what they can do and being opportunistic. However, the landscape has changed, and it is changing. We're not just dealing with that opportunistic attack anymore. The landscape, it's not static. It is in a state of rapid evolution. So what might have been seen as rudimentary kind of many years ago is actually a lot more sophisticated, targeted, and effectively quite relentless. Now, that might be because it's nation state sponsored. It might be criminal crime groups. But what they are effectively doing is targeting UK SMEs. They're targeting UK SMEs because actually they know that is where the weak points exist. And it might be because the skill set doesn't exist. It might be that, as Stephen mentioned earlier on in the session, the barrier to entry to access cybersecurity support has always been quite high, and it's meant that actually being able to get that support has been difficult. And that might just be purely from a budgetary perspective. It might also be from an awareness perspective. Now, the attackers know this, and so if they're trying to get access to that primary organization, they are going through, whether it's the primary, the tier 2 or the tier 3 supplier, in order to get to their end destination. And it goes back to what I said earlier about trying to understand who you're talking to, who you're sharing data with, but also logically and technically who is connected to who, when and for what purpose. Because it's those connections, certainly from a digital perspective, that create vulnerability. And it's that vulnerability that the attackers are actively looking for to exploit in order to find the weakest link. You'll hear in industry around, the supply chain attack and what that looks like. And there's a lot of focus on that, rightfully so, because, we've only got to look at, to name a few around, Marks and Spencer's and Co-op and Harrods, JLR recently. There's so many examples whereby, a lot of the source of this has been because of supply chain and supply chain issues. And so it's important to understand that we can't lose sight and focus on that. Now, I'm just going to flick through here because we've pretty much done a talk over on some of this anyway. But the final point I will make just on this slide, it's the bottom right there in terms of AI-powered attack and automated infiltration. So the key thing to understand here is, as an organization, we're here and we exist to be commercial. We will also have an ethical stance, safety as a priority, quality front and center, and hopefully we start to see security more aligned to safety and quality across the industry to have that same sense of impetus and importance. Now, on the outside, in terms of the threat actor and the rise of AI-powered attacks, they have a lot more time on their hands because they have one primary focus, and that is identifying vulnerabilities to exploit and attack. Now, they are commercial entities and criminal organized groups like no other, but they just have one goal, which is to attack and try and compromise organizations. So with the rise of AI, it's becoming a lot easier for them to do that. It's a lot easier for them to generate new attack vectors and code that we don't know exists yet. So it's just trying to understand that shift of balance is getting kind of larger and in the favor of the attacker.
Can I just quickly contextualize a little bit more on that as well, Gaz? Because obviously, in the last few months, we have seen a lot of cyber attacks and successful cyber attacks within aerospace industry. Only recently, the likes of Qantas, the likes of Collins Aerospace, they have effects across the supply chain. We've seen airports grind to a halt because of software provided by suppliers in the supply chain, and that then has that effect across. So we're not talking about situations that are conceptual here. This is like real world stuff, and whether it be technological, as Gareth has laid out there, which a lot of the larger scale attacks are, a lot of the times it's really not technologically driven. It's human and behavior led attacks. So you will all know terms like phishing, where you get a fake email and it's got to click the link and all of that sort of thing. That side of social engineering is way less, let's find some code and inject it over here and get access to this bit of software. It can be just denying access for a company that is vital within a supply chain that stops everything else going up. We're seeing it happen in real world. The last couple of days we've found out about data breaches at Qantas, and undoubtedly they will they will have effects for a number of different people across the industry. Sorry, go on, Gaz.
Thanks, Stephen. Appreciate it. And Stephen mentioned phishing there. Sometimes I think it's overused in the industry, but then I think in kind of real terms and think actually it really isn't. I think there needs to be more awareness around it. And we look at kind of UK government stats at the moment, and it's 85% are phishing-based attacks. So you can look at that and say, well, actually, some of the easiest ways of defense are training and giving awareness to your workforce. So, where you look at, yes, you need the technology, but that doesn't necessarily equate into massive 6-7-figure sums that effectively, quite frankly, for UK SME, you can't afford. But actually, getting your organization, your workforce, your key staff aware of what the threat is and how to avoid it, very tangible, very effective, actually doesn't cost a lot. It's the time and the energy, the effort to do it and put those programs in place. And so what we tend to look at is, across that industry, how can you be practical and work with what you've got to create the most impact and benefit? And if we look at, actually, like I say, 85% is a big number, and that is to do with phishing, targeting your workforces. But actually, you can be very effective via good training and awareness to combat that risk, and it doesn't have to cost you the earth in terms of doing that. So I think it's just an important thing to understand and realise. Okay, so the shift from compliance to actual defence. So I mentioned, and I'm just going to label this point and labour on it, in that that whole mindset of, if we meet compliance, if we're certified, if we abide by the relevant regulations, then we're secure. But I think, as we've kind of discussed, that whole box ticking exercise doesn't equate to real world protection. So what we're saying is that compliance approach provides a baseline. Now, that baseline might be because you've had a set of guidelines to follow, and it takes you through a journey. And we talk about a journey to compliance in the title of this webinar, and what not to do, because ultimately it can be often backward looking. These frameworks are based on past threats, the established standards that may have been set 2, 3, 4, 5 years ago, and them themselves need to kind of keep pace of what the future is and what the future looks like. You could argue, probably successfully, that it's like preparing for yesterday's weather. It doesn't make sense. So we've got to look at how we can move that forward and be more proactive. And again, I say it's the baseline, it's the foundations. It helps you move forward in terms of what you need to do looking ahead. Now, if we think about what we should move towards from having a good baseline, it's being proactive, it's being real time in our ability to identify, detect, and respond to threats as they either look at us, start to seek to compromise our businesses. Now, that in itself, threat hunting, that sounds quite exciting, doesn't it? But to kind of the non-initiated cyber amongst us, which might just be the three of us, I'm not sure. What that basically is saying is, have you got the right mechanisms, processes, technology in place, and also people in order to identify whether a threat is inbound to your organization? Now, there's a stat. I'm not going to say I remember how old it is. I think it probably comes from a year ago, so it's probably updated slightly from now. But on average, you're probably looking at around 220 days from when an attacker has looked at you, compromised a business, and just almost lays dormant. So that ability to understand whether you've been compromised or not is actually really important. Now, they lay dormant for one very particular reason. They may have compromised a member of staff because they've sent a phishing email. Now, that staff member, in terms of their credentials, actually is relatively insignificant in terms of what they actually want and how they can exploit the business. So within that kind of average 220 days, they decide to lay dormant, silent, as stealthy as they can be within the organization to see how they can elevate their privileges. Because ultimately, there's no point, attacking a business if all you're going to get is a couple of files on an end user's machine. It doesn't really do much. It's wasted effort. It's wasted time. So they're always trying to see where they can move laterally or up the chain within an organization. And ultimately, they will then strike when they see the best opportunity. So that part up front of understanding and identifying and detecting the threat before it's able to even do anything is really important. Now, we hear a lot, whether it's cyber or just general business in the industry around resilience. It's one of those things that, the perception of which can be quite hard to achieve. And whenever you say end goal in cyber, everyone always looks at you like you've got no head. And it's like, well, really? Can we really get an end goal if the threat is ever evolving and rapid and always changing? Well, actually, resilience, if we think about it in the context of cyber, is a mindset. It's not necessarily a tangible, bolt on of lots of technology and people and process, and it's all doing all this crazy stuff and lights are going off right and center in data centers doing funky stuff. But it's that mindset of understanding that, I know that we will have threats that point at us. And that whole, it's not a case of if, but when kind of mindset of understanding we know we will be attacked, but actually we're in control. And in control doesn't have to mean that the attack doesn't materialize. I think we're in a real world now where these attacks will materialize. They are materializing. However, the resilient mindset and the posture of we are in control gets organizations to the point of saying, when it happens, we're going to deal with it because we detect it. We can respond quickly and we can minimize the impacts that threat or attack actually has on our business. And it's that we want to concentrate when we talk around the topic of resilience and what that means in organizations. So if we talk about maybe some of the areas that we tangibly look at as part of complementing that mindset, is there any one of those 5 points that anyone hasn't heard of?
So patch management
Okay.
is a new one that's just been raised in the chat. If you want to give a little bit more in depth as to what you mean by strong patch management, Gaz, that'd be great.
Perfect.
If you want to start with that one, I'll see what the other things coming in are soon.
Okay, fantastic. Thank you. So patch management, what does that mean? So effectively, you've got two areas. One is a lot easier than the other. So when we consider corporate IT and technology, and that might be your Windows laptop, your Mac computer, it might be a physical server. The ability to identify a vulnerability and effectively fix it or patch it. So these vulnerabilities exist because there's been a change in code. It's these vulnerabilities that actually the attackers look to identify and use adverse code to exploit. And it's therefore upon us to, whether it's vendor driven or our own internal development teams, to ensure that where a vulnerability exists or has been identified, that we're able to identify it quickly, fix it, patch it, test that fix has been deployed effectively, and then move forward. So having a strong patch cycle that allows us to identify, understand what that criticality is because sometimes you get a load of vulnerabilities that are deemed to be insignificant, or it's just for information. They may present low or medium risk, versus vulnerabilities that are critical and graded as high, that we've got a process that allows us to manage that effectively. And it also might be that there's nervousness around it. So sometimes when you deploy a fix or a patch, it can break, whether it's a web application, whether it's a local install of software on-prem. It might even be a Windows update on a laptop. Things do happen that shouldn't. And so what a lot of organizations do sensibly is they will allow a certain period of time for whether it's others in industry that have just gone quick and actually there's been an issue that's been found, to understand actually the vendor's able to iron out some of those issues. Naturally, we can then work on a patch cycle from there. The second part is operational technology, and we call it OT devices. So if we think the factory floor, a lot of OT devices are decades old, certainly in the heart of manufacturing. And being decades old, they were never designed to be connected to the internet. Now, that presents its own challenge in its own right, because if you've got a piece of machinery that is incredibly effective of what it does, but it just so happens to be old and it can't be patched, there's certain things, and I think we'll touch on it later, but we might as well address it now. There's certain kind of things that you can look to do, and it might be that you segregate your operational technology, your factory floor, from your corporate IT. So you're effectively ring fencing what can't be patched because it will break, or there physically just isn't a patch available, but it might be very effective for your business. So at least if it is compromised, it's isolated and it doesn't have a knock-on impact on business. Now, I'm not going to say it, but I would suggest of the kind of the 4, 5, 6 names I mentioned earlier, it's that type of kind of missing part of lack of segregation that causes errors in the supply chain and allows that web of connectedness to actually cause some real pain. But I'll pause there. Stephen, anything further?
Cool. No, I think to condense that a little bit, we know what patch management is, the update of the software systems that we use as and when they happen. But when we talk about strong patch management, it's that practice, that hygiene practice of backups in place. What is our time after release of patch to measure it, and then we implement it. The ring fencing, kind of everything that you said there, Gaz, really good. One more that we had that was asked about in the chat. Do you want to just talk us through EDR, endpoint detection and response?
Yes. Okay. So you met another acronym there, Stephen.
I thought I'd give it for everyone. So if it's mentioned, it's cleared off.
Yeah. So we've got EDR, MDR, XDR, all manner of acronyms in this space. But effectively, this goes back to what we touched on earlier in terms of how do we rapidly, in real time, or at least near time, detect a threat and what that looks like. So if we think in simple terms, an endpoint being one example, a laptop computer, do we have the effective process and technology, in which case software, that allows us to identify a threat on that machine, but also who's actually looking at that? So if I take something very, very basic, a Windows laptop has Microsoft 365 and you're in the cloud. Really, really basic. Now that in itself has native technology that allows certain vulnerabilities to be identified. That's great. But actually, is anyone looking at it? And if they are looking at it, have they got the resource to then do something about it, but also bring the organization on that journey of actually we're all at risk, or maybe one machine is just at risk. So having that endpoint detection response capability just enables us at the base level to identify whether there's an issue or not and where that issue exists to ensure we can respond to it effectively. We've got cyber hygiene in place, and let's just assume that we've got good cyber hygiene in place, but actually it still doesn't mean we understand our risk. Now, typically when I roll this presentation out to audiences and in person, I generally try and kind of get a lot of hands going up and down, and we always ask the question of, do you understand your risk? Do you understand what you have and what you use? But also, generally people get their hands up, say, yep, good, we've got a general idea. And then we ask the kind of the killer question of, well, do you truly understand your supply chain? Now, again, from a sector perspective, I think when we speak to organizations and we say, look, do you understand your primary suppliers, who they are, where they are, what they do for you? Generally speaking, you get a relatively positive response. But actually, when you then go down to tier 2 and tier 3, that's when we get the blank looks and the, well, actually, yeah, we've not really considered it. I've come across a couple of organizations, certainly in the last 12 months, that have started to do a bit more digging and drilling down into what that looks like and trying to understand the broader risk and impact. But generally speaking, across the sector, it's not as good as we would like it to be. And if you don't understand what that threat looks like, again, across the supply chain, how can you then effectively be resilient and secure as an organization yourselves? Now, it might seem that I'm laboring this point around supply chain. If I did this a year ago, there'd be a bit of a focus. It would be mentioned, but there is more focus on it now because of the real world attacks and where they are coming from and how they are getting to their primary targets. And so I can't stress enough that identifying your suppliers and the tier 2s to tier 3s to an extent and understanding how they're connected is really important. Now, we get to a point where we've got all this good stuff in place, and we're doing, some great technology, and we've got processes, and we're training our staff, and there's people that are there to help and support. But actually, let's test ourselves. If we've got all this great stuff, is it that we've just got a paper shield, as we mentioned at the start, that looks great to an auditor and allows us to be certified to get a commercial contract, or are we actually effective? And the only way we can do that is by actually testing how good we are and how responsive we are, and where the staff, when an email does come in, know that looks like phishing or that looks, somewhat dodgy. Now, I'm conscious of time. We'll kind of just close on the future of cybersecurity in the sector. Now, we mentioned operational technology earlier. And like I said, corporate IT, with the vendors that are out there, Microsoft, Google, AWS, the common stuff in terms of releasing fixes, patches, updates, they've spent, whole lives, if it were, being able to release and update and understand what that process looks like for us as effectively customers. But those decade-old machines that we still rely on today that provide, critical daily kind of requirements for our businesses, it's those that tend to be at risk, and trying to understand how we segregate is really important. But that is not going to go away. That's just going to get more of a focus from the attackers. We've not really mentioned APTs, again, another acronym, unfortunately, but Advanced Persistent Threats. These are not your children in bedrooms and basements. These generally tend to be organized criminal crime groups, state-sponsored organizations, because effectively these are run like businesses like anyone else, that are highly sophisticated, highly funded, and they've got so much time on their hands to identify where your weak links are and what that looks like for them to be able to exploit. We mentioned about supply chain, less protected partners on SMEs. Again, that's just going to get bigger. We talked earlier around AI enhanced attacks. And I'm just going to finish with the word quantum computing. Now, I am by no means, I wouldn't dare say expert in quantum, even at a base level of quantum computing. And I'm not even going to do a poll, I think, on the on the webinar to see who is or who isn't. But I think maybe that does strike us as somewhat alarming if I put that back on myself, in that, we run a cybersecurity business. I've spent 20 years in cyber. I am actively saying, look, I'm not an expert in this space. This is going to be completely new to me and to our organization. And the power and the impact that this is going to create, we all need to be ahead of this and trying to understand threats, benefits. Danny mentioned opportunity. There will be a massive opportunity with this as well. So it's just trying to understand and balance what that looks like in the future. So I know I've kind of whistle-stopped towards the end there, and we're short on time, but Stephen, if I hand back to yourself and open up if there's any questions at all.
Yeah, fab. Thank you, Gareth. Thank you for that, mate. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. If you do want to reach out, you do want to ask any questions, please feel free to do so. I think my final point on this is, if I was to make a recommendation to anyone who doesn't really know about cyber but wants to think about tackling it within their businesses, and this is no way me saying you should reach out to me, find a trusted advisor, someone who knows more about this than you, that you can ask a question to, that you can bounce things off, and that's absolutely a way for you to start. Just speak to someone who knows a little bit more. Gaz, we have just had one question.
Yeah.
Should the Civil Aviation Authority be using Cyber Essentials / Cyber Essentials Plus for the supply chain in aviation? What's your opinion?
It's a great question, and it's a shame Danny's still not on being the founding member of the governing body for Cyber Essentials. I think, look, for me, in yes, I think is the quick response. I mean, some organisations love it. Some organisations feel that it's potentially a bit basic. For me, for UK SMEs, 100% yes. Because it gives you not only kind of the process layer, but it gives you the practical mechanisms in terms of vulnerability management and kind of technical security beyond maybe some of the other kind of certifications that maybe are just more risk and broad brush, ISO 27001, for example. But it has a lot of good practical steps that, again, I say the word UK SMEs, certainly for UK SMEs, that you can adopt, relatively straightforward, quite easy, quick to adopt, and relatively pain free for organisations. So I would say yes on that.
I think it's very much a case of, like we said earlier, Gaz, certainly from our business's perspective, we want to make sure that we are raising the baseline, not just in aerospace, but nationally in terms of industry for business, to protect economic growth, to protect job creation, and look after people further down that business scale where the rest of our industry only focus up at the top. And if we're focused on improving the baseline, to answer that question there, Cyber Essentials Plus for the supply chain as a measurement, it does exactly that. It raises the baseline. So if it's there as an expectation, then yes, I would say it's a really, really good start to look at ensuring that your supply chain is doing the right thing. And I think that as a question, when we talk about should the Civil Aviation Authority be doing that, that then brings us full circle back to where we started of, actually, there is a real commercial opportunity for businesses who are smaller SMEs to go ahead and get those levels of compliance in place, take those first steps, be be on the road to improving their security posture, you're going to start to see wins where maybe your competitors won't, and it can be a real commercial differentiator. So thank you for that question. I want to say thank you, obviously, to Danny, who's had to shoot off. He's at another event later on this afternoon. But thank you, Danny, for coming in and setting the scene. Gareth, thank you very much for your insightful presentation. And I want to say thank you to everyone who's joined us, and especially to the team at the North West Aerospace Alliance for working with us to get this all set up. Thank you very much, everyone. Reach out if you do have any questions. Otherwise, have a very safe rest of your day. See you later.